Good evening. I hereby call this January the 11th meeting of the Public Safety Committee to order. Due to the Safer at Home order, all committee members are participating virtually. For virtual meetings, committee members will be muted until asked to be heard. When there is a vote, it will be necessary to take a roll call vote. A committee member will be recognized and will raise their hand and state their vote. Committee members are Councilmember John Larson, who is the Vice Chair, Councilmember Kevin Mundy, and Councilmember Barbara Haynes.
I do a pretty good soup. That's a turkey soup.
If we can put a mute on that, please. Thank you. Items on the consent agenda are approved with one sweeping motion unless a member of this committee or council wishes an item to be pulled for consideration. There are two items on the consent agenda. Members of the committee, are there any items should be pulled? And if there are not, I'd entertain a motion, please.
Move approval.
Second.
Second by Councilmember Burke. We'll go to the roll call for approval of the consent agenda. Councilman Larson.
Yes.
Councilman Mundy.
Aye.
Councilwoman Burke.
Yes.
And that is a yes from me, so the consent agenda is approved unanimously. We'll move to item G1, please.
Item G1, ordinance amending Chapter 18, Section 18-21 of the City Code entitled Curfew and Other Restrictions Authorized During State of Emergency.
Thank you, ma'am. I see our city attorney has joined us, Attorney Carmen. We'll turn it over to her for the introduction.
Good afternoon, Chairman Taylor, members of the Public Safety Committee, Mayor, and other council members. This particular item will amend Chapter 18 to allow the mayor's declaration, emergency declaration, to be enforced by civil means, in particular enforcement through civil penalties. It will allow the city manager to designate the appropriate city staff to do that civil enforcement process, which usually entails a notice of violation and so forth. And it also updates some code references based upon some statutory changes and allows the mayor to amend his emergency declaration to incorporate therein provisions from the governor's executive orders as he deems appropriate. That's the amendment in a nutshell.
Pretty cut and dry, members of the committee. Are there any questions or concerns for Ms. Carmen? Mr. Mundy.
Thank you, Chairman Taylor. The question is, this is just changing so that we can implement at a later date. This is not really a practical outline of how this would work. Is that correct?
It will become effective upon adoption, so it moves to City Council at its Tuesday meeting, so it will become effective on January 19th upon adoption. Now, in terms of the practical enforcement side, the city manager, based upon this ordinance, will determine what city staff will actually enforce the mayor's executive emergency declaration, and certainly he can provide City Council with an update as to which departments he's decided will enforce it in the enforcement process. But it will become effective on Tuesday.
Okay, thank you.
Councilwoman Scipio.
Yes, I have one question, Attorney Carmen. Under Section L, where it says violations of this article, it reads that there is a fine, a civil penalty in the amount of $100 per day. Is that the minimum or the maximum or just the amount?
That is the amount.
Okay, that will, okay.
Yes, and it's a separate amount for each separate violations, but that is the amount.
And I noticed that the part that was changing was not exceeding $500 and or imprisonment not exceeding 30 days. So we've taken that part of it out. Is that because of some preceding statute?
That is the criminal enforcement aspect of the ordinance, and we're essentially referencing the criminal statutes instead of putting that language in there because it does change sometimes with changes in the statute. We just simply decided to reference the criminal statute. That's the best way to handle that.
Oh, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Councilman Larson.
For Attorney Carmen, for simplicity of explanation to the public, would you provide a quick summary as to who declares curfews and restrictions authorizing state of emergency and the enforcement of that under this legislation, as what changes that would actually affect the current policy? You give me a quick summary of differences.
Sure, I'll be happy to. Under the current ordinance, it is the mayor, based upon the ordinance, that declares a state of emergency. And the current ordinance allows the mayor to adopt various provisions consistent with the ordinance. As you may recall, there's now in the mayor's emergency declaration a mask provision requiring citizens to wear masks. And there's also a provision regarding occupancy limits and so forth. This ordinance pretty much allows the mayor to continue with that protocol, but it also allows the mayor to incorporate into his emergency declaration any provisions that the governor has in his executive order that the governor has on occasion asked the mayors across the state of North Carolina to incorporate into their emergency declarations. So it gives him that additional authority. And also, as it currently stands, the emergency declaration is enforced through criminal means, through the assessment of a criminal fine, and so forth. So this additional language will allow also civil enforcement, which will give some relief to the police department and allow the manager to designate city personnel to do that civil enforcement process, which is basically a civil penalty instead of a criminal fine.
Right. And the enforcers of that under non-police enforcement would be designated by the city manager's office? Is that the way that works?
That is correct.
So the city manager would designate additional enforcers within city government to enforce the ordinances or the curfews or what emergency conditions.
Right, that's correct.
Thank you for that clarity. I think that's much clearer. Thank you.
Councilman Mundy.
I'm sorry, Attorney Carmen, one additional question. The way I'm reading this, it talks about any person violating. Would this verbiage also cover businesses, and would they be fined in a different way or as described in this document?
They would be defined as described in this ordinance. In Chapter 1 of the City Code, person is defined to include a business.
Thank you.
The businesses are covered.
If all questions are satisfied, if there is additional discussion, I'd like to get a motion on the floor first, please.
So moved.
Moved by Councilman Larson. Is there a second?
Second.
Councilman Mundy?
Second.
Okay. Is there any discussion this time? Seeing no discussion, we'll move to the roll call. Councilman Larson.
Yes.
Councilman Mundy.
Aye.
Councilwoman Burke.
Yes.
And that is a yes from me, so that is unanimous. Thank you, Attorney Carmen.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Item G2, please.
Item G2, report from WPR Consulting LLC on Winston-Salem Fire Department cultural and climate assessment.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Before we move into the presentation, I just want to take a moment and just review the timeline to all interested parties who've been waiting to hear about this item. So on July 20th, Omnibus and Head Out of Winston-Salem held a press conference alleging racism, harassment, and ethnic intimidation within the Winston-Salem Fire Department. Mayor Pro Tem Adams and I met with the members of Omnibus and Head Out on behalf of the City Council, and we discussed their concerns on August the 7th. We collectively agreed to a plan of action, which was moving toward a climate assessment to review those allegations. The City Council then directed immediately the city manager in August to conduct a climate assessment, to work with Omnibus, our internal auditors, and any other interested fire department employee to assess the condition of the fire department. In August, we did hire WPR Consulting to conduct that climate assessment. And today we'll hear the report on their findings. I'd just like to turn this part of the presentation now over to Mr. Damon DeCain, who will begin discussions on the project scope and the findings from WPR Consulting. Mr. DeCain.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman Taylor. Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem, members of the committee, and members of the City Council. The chairman basically did my job for me, and I'm very appreciative of that. I will say that as the chairman discussed, that this was not an investigation into individual claims. Those circumstances and those issues are being handled by the city attorney's office and your HR department. This is a comprehensive look at our department, and it also gathered information from the community about the perspectives that the community has of our department. That's incredibly important. We provide essential life-saving services, and it's important to know what our community thinks. The gentlemen that I have the absolute honor and privilege to introduce to you are Mr. Willie Ratchford and Dr. Anthony Wade of WPR Consulting. I hope you had a chance to look at their bios in the item before you. They're both nationally recognized experts in this field. They've been doing this work their entire careers on many levels. And they're both currently HR and human resources professionals. And they came extremely highly recommended by our peer cities. Another member of the team was Ms. Francesca Adams of our Office of Performance and Accountability and Internal Audit. Her role was to basically facilitate all the work to make us look good, the three of us. And Francesca has a passion for this work. She has an aptitude for it. And Ms. Adams will be leading the efforts moving forward to not only carry out the recommendations of this study, but much of this work can be applied citywide to all departments. So we'll be utilizing her skills along with other things that the manager has in the works to carry these efforts forward. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Mr. Ratchford and Dr. Anthony Wade. Thank you, Chairman.
You got the floor, gentlemen. And sir, if you can hear us, you're on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. First of all, thank you, Damon, and thank you all for the introduction. Again, I'm Willie Ratchford, and on with me is Dr. Anthony Wade, and we represent a small consulting firm out of Charlotte that is called WPR Consulting. We consider ourselves to be a full-service diversity, equity, and inclusion firm that partners with clients in the public and private, nonprofit, and higher education sectors to build sustainable social and informative change, especially as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The type services that we provide include environmental scan and SWOT analysis, of what we're now calling SWOT analysis, because initially with that particular work, we would look at one's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And the SWOT, or the A, means that you add alternative considerations that you might consider for a given entity that you might be working for. We also do in-person and virtual employee engagement, which we engaged a lot in during this particular process. We do personalized DEI training to improve staff cultural competencies, and we do culture and climate assessments that should help to guide partnerships and actions required for welcoming inclusive environments in both the public and the private sector. Next slide, please. As has been indicated earlier, we were retained by the city of Winston-Salem to complete a cultural assessment of allegations of racism and discrimination within the fire department, to come up with some recommendations that would help to address those allegations and help the fire department to start out on a path that would make diversity, equity, and inclusion standard operating procedure within the department. And as the assistant city manager indicated earlier, this has some universal applications in that the ideas and suggestions that we'll be presenting to you tonight might also be used with other city departments. We also looked at addressing technical training and technical assistance that the city and the fire department might need to move forward with this work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have developed a comprehensive diversity, equity, and inclusion training module that we feel can be used to improve the cultural competency of fire employees and other staff as needed. This particular module that we've developed is one where if you aren't really ready to deal with the truth, if you can't handle the truth, you probably shouldn't engage in this particular training, because it is about truth-telling and having the real hard and substantive conversation around difference that's going to move the Winston-Salem Fire Department forward, as well as the city of Winston-Salem. We're going to have Anthony, Dr. Wade, to talk to you a little about the process that we have engaged in. And as we go through the process, at some point we will share the assessment that we've made around the Winston-Salem Fire Department, as well as we have some conversation about the history, which led us to come to some of the conclusions in the assessment, and also that helped us to decide on the recommendations that we think the Winston-Salem Fire Department and the city of Winston-Salem might need to consider in order to move forward. So Dr. Wade, if you would talk for a few minutes about process.
Certainly, and thank you. It's good to be with all of you this evening. So we looked at this in a fairly straightforward manner, but one that we felt was very comprehensive. Part of that involves looking at the situation presented to us through a number of different lenses. And so obviously, one of the first lenses that we had to utilize was the lens that was internal to the city as well as to the department. And with that, we conducted interviews and focus groups with over 120 individuals to include the staff of the fire department, city manager's office. We had conversations with the city's human relations department. We also met with the city's human resources director. We were trying to get a complete picture to the greatest extent possible through the eyes of the individuals who are involved with this, from a C-suite level, from a corporate suite level, down to where the rubber meets the road, where you have folks out there doing the important work of public safety in terms of the fire profession. Clearly, we also needed to see how this scenario was being viewed externally, because one of the things that we felt that the organization was attempting to respond to was internal feedback specific to their perceptions about what was going on inside the organization. And so we had those conversations with Omnibus, with Hate Out of Winston. We had conversations also with the Urban League and the NAACP and other individuals. We needed to look at what the city's racial and ethnic demographics were, primarily because they could be tied to issues as to what the demographics of the organization are. The fire department is specific, the representation, whether or not that lends itself to the discussions about equity and inclusion. All those things were important to discuss in this particular assessment. We looked, of course, at the social media posts. That goes back to the whole conversation about how people view the organization from the outside. If it's on social media, then that lends a perception of what the organization is about to residents as well as to other employees. And certainly not least, the history of the Winston-Salem Fire Department was one of the things that we found to be very, very rich. Just the fact that since 1980, out of 6 of your fire chiefs, 4 have been Black. That's a significant statement when you look across the profession, not just in North Carolina, but throughout the nation. I think that was something that if it had not been highlighted before, I thought that was something that should be highlighted, and took the opportunity to make it part of this report. Next slide, please. One of the things that we had to do was to create a safe harbor, safe space, because we wanted people to discuss their feelings, how they see things. The folks who are members of the fire department, they needed to have that level of safe space in order to be candid, to be open, to express their feelings, their emotions. And as such, we put them through a exercise that allowed them to do, it was multifaceted. It allowed them to tell their stories. It allowed them to talk about what the Winston-Salem Fire Department would look like as if it was an ideal place to work. They talked about their feelings specific to how they were being viewed. And they also had the opportunity to talk about what role they might be willing to play in order to move the organization forward. and to continue to create that premier fire service organization in the 21st century. And we use that conversation module just not with employees, but also similar questions with community groups as well as individuals that we met with. And again, the focus was to highlight diversity, equity, and inclusion as it applied to this scenario, but it was so important to get a handle on how people saw the organization, because their views are reality. And if you believe something is being real, it's real to you, even when it may not be completely accurate. So it was important to address the reality of situations. It was important to address the perception of reality, and we were able to get to that in a fairly comprehensive way through the model that was utilized. Next slide. Mr.
So as Dr. Wade has indicated, in order for us to come up with the recommendations that we finally arrived to, in order to come to the assessments that we actually made, we engaged in a number of analytical and management techniques. And after our multiple meetings with community groups in the city of Winston-Salem, with the city manager and his staff, the fire department personnel, including meeting with the chief and his executive team, we thought that was important. And I just want to reiterate the necessity of the conversation modules that we had, and we felt that we really did create that safe space, which allowed people to say what they really felt about what was going on within the fire department. And they were quite honest in the process. And as you all get an opportunity to go through the body of the report, you will see what it is that we're talking about. But as a result of the analysis, we took an opportunity again to look at some of the history, and I'm going to share some of that history in a few minutes. We were able to come up with the what we feel is the cultural climate that is possessed by the Winston-Salem Fire Department. As I mentioned earlier, we did the SWOT analysis where we looked at the strengths, the weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to the Winston-Salem Fire Department, especially as it relates to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We created this 86-page training module. It may take 6 to 8 hours to actually go through this training, but it is very comprehensive, and we think it will be helpful to the fire department as well as to other departments within the city of Winston-Salem. One of the things that we discovered during this process is, and most of you on this call tonight already know this, it is very difficult to have a conversation about race, especially when you have Black folk and white folk in the room. People normally can't talk to each other because you're afraid that if you say something that is misinterpreted, you might be perceived as racist. So people will, in these type conversations, will engage in what they think is the politically correct thing to do. So we've created this module which will allow, if used properly, will allow not only fire staff, but members of city council, as well as other departments within the city of Winston-Salem, to have the real tough conversation around race. And one of the things that Dr. Wade and I have discovered in our over combined 80 years of doing this work is that it is real easy to have a conversation about race if you have a relationship first. If you know each other and you like each other, it really does become a real easy conversation. And so we're using this module to sort of speed that process up, such that it talks about the necessity of relationship and how that can lead to the type of honest conversation around race. We also created a conversation module which allows groups of 20 or more to sit down and have a conversation about the impact of race and racism and its effects on Black, brown, and white people. And this is about a 2 to 3 hour training module, but something that we think is necessary if the city of Winston-Salem and its fire department is going to move forward to deal with these issues and these allegations of racism and discrimination. Then, of course, we came up with a list of 19 recommendations. And once we go away, we thought it would be important that the City of Winston-Salem has a resource list to look at other groups or organizations that you might call on in the future to continue this work as you seek to make diversity, equity, and inclusion standard operating procedure in the City of Winston-Salem. Next slide, please.
Mr. Rashford, I have a quick question for you.
Yes, sir.
Is there anyone who wanted to speak to you or to Dr. Wade that was denied the opportunity to do so?
No one was denied an opportunity to speak with us. When we set this up, we set up these opportunities for these focus groups, but we recognize that there are people who don't like to talk in a group setting. Their preference would be to speak one-on-one. So we open the doors to allow anyone who wanted to speak one-on-one, or if they wanted to bring someone with them, they could. We would set that up. We actually had only 2 people who took advantage of that, and but then they dropped that because they did not show up for the times that we set up. Not only did we set up those times, we are still available to talk to anyone who wants to talk to us about this process and how they may contribute, how they might contribute to it.
Thank you, sir.
We actually came back to the city a couple of times just because we wanted to be available to individuals, and we were there for the full day, just in the event that folks did want to talk. They had the opportunity to, and to Mr. Rashford's comments, absolutely, we're still available if people still want to have those types of conversations, sir.
So one of the things I want to do in talking about history, let me start off by talking about video versus audio. So some of the audio that we had heard prior to coming to Winston-Salem was that the Winston-Salem Fire Department was a racist organization and that the chief of the fire department was a racist. So that was the audio that we were hearing. And we had no way of knowing one way or the other whether either of those things were true. And we figured the best way that we could determine some truth would be to look at the video. And there are multiple things that creates video, including the history of the Winston-Salem Fire Department. And in our research, we found the fire department to be a very progressive organization that has been ahead, that has been a leader in the country when it comes to issue of race and integration, dating back to as early as 1951, when the Winston-Salem Fire Department hired and formed the city and the state's first integrated fire company. In 1967, the department became fully integrated. Again, one of the very few during that time in our history to be fully integrated. In 1973, Sandra Walden was hired as a public safety officer, and this made her the first paid woman firefighter, not only in Winston-Salem, but also in the state of North Carolina. And there's some research that says that she may have been the first woman in the country who was a paid firefighter with a municipality's fire department. As Dr. Wade had mentioned earlier, since 1980, you all have had a total of 6 fire chiefs, and 4 of those are African Americans. So as you can see, as I'm going through this, this is the video that was starting to develop and that we were beginning to see. If you look at the current makeup of the fire department today, minorities make up 55% of the senior staff of the Winston-Salem Fire Department. So as we're going through this history and doing this research and building this video, we're beginning to think, okay, well, if organizations that are racist does not have this type of pedigree, they don't have this kind of history. And so we're beginning to get this picture. If we could move to the next slide, please. Since 2015, if we look at the Winston-Salem Fire Department and the way that people of color have advanced in the fire department, we found that the fire department has utilized media placement services to target electronic hiring ads to fire service minorities. So they've been mindful that they need to make efforts to recruit from the inner cities in the inner city neighborhoods there in Winston-Salem. They've utilized segmented marketing services in many Black communities in Winston-Salem. They've created a majority minority interview panel, which consisted of one Black female, one Black male, one Hispanic male, and a white male. They participated in local career and cultural affairs with the Urban League and the Hispanic League. One of the interesting things that happened during this process was when we met with the president of the Urban League, he spoke very highly of the Winston-Salem Fire Department, and he talked about how fire staff have worked with the Urban League to help people of color when it comes to making career decisions about fire service. And we got the same type of feedback from some Hispanic groups that we actually spoke with. Since 2015, you've created the Winston-Salem recruiting profiles, which features minorities in the Winston-Salem Fire Department telling how they found their way to the fire service. The Winston-Salem Fire Department has assigned mentors to recruits during the fire academy, and all fire staff in the fire department get an opportunity to have a mentor moving forward once they become employed. They co-sponsored the fire certification program at Glenn High School with the Kernersville Fire Department. And again, this is development of this video, which would lead one to think, well, maybe this is not necessarily a racist organization. Next page, please. Since 2015, the Winston-Salem Fire Department has promoted the first Black female battalion chief. They have promoted the second white female battalion chief. And it's important to mention this, the white females in the department, because many of the women that we talked to indicated that while they were not dealing with racial problems within the fire department, they did indicate that there were gender issues that they've had to address and face. So we felt it was important to let you all know that. Again, since 2015, promoted the first Black female division chief. They promoted the first white female division chief, promoted the first Black male division chief, promoted the first firefighter director to captain, who was a Hispanic male, and they promoted the first Black female deputy fire marshal. Again, this is important in terms of the Winston-Salem Fire Department being a very progressive department and not being what the audio would lead one to believe that they are. Next page, please. Also, since 2015, if you look at career development within the Winston-Salem Fire Department, the department assigned the first Black captain to Rescue 1. 4 of 6 safety and training captains are actually African Americans. The department's first and only graduate of the National Fire Academy's Managing Officer Program is a Black male. The first 2 minorities, a Black male and a Black female, in departmental history have been credentialed as fire chief officers by the Center for Public Safety Excellence. 2 Black senior staff members are enrolled in the National Fire Academy's Executive Fire Officer Program, and a 3rd minority application is currently pending. The first graduate of the International Association of Fire Chiefs Diversity Executive Leadership Program is actually an African-American female, and a Black captain is currently assigned to acting status to fill a battalion chief vacancy. And they have assigned 4 Black captains to attend the Carl Holmes Executive Development Institute at Dillard University for the first time in the history of the Winston-Salem Fire Department. And again, this is informative of the video that we've been seeing, and it does not sound anything like any of the audio that we've been having regarding the Winston-Salem Fire Department. Next slide, please.
If I could ask a question,
Sure.
One of the things that we didn't have an opportunity to ask earlier or should have asked is, how much time do we have for this presentation?
We've probably got about 5 or 10 more minutes. So though this is important, we'll need you to move through it as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so this last slide here on history shows that they recruited the department's first Black chaplain. They appointed the department's first honorary fire chiefs, who were 2 Black males. They supported inclusion of Willie Carter and Robert Greer, 2 of the first 8 Black firefighters who integrated the Station 4 in 1951 in AT&T's 2019 Heritage Calendar. And they supported the Elizabeth Birdstone submission of Red, Black, and White to the 2018 Writers Digest Writing Competition. And this is the story about the integration of the fire department back in 1951. And it's our understanding that this piece won 4th place in the magazine's feature article category. And with that, I'm going to ask Anthony if he would talk with you a little about, on the next slide, about the climate assessment.
Climate assessment, yes.
That we've made.
And per the chairman's earlier comment, we're going to move through this expeditiously. So all of this information you have, you certainly can read it at your leisure. So there are some highlights. Number one, items that I guess should be highlighted. There is some community groups, they expressed a concern that Chief Mayo was racist or is racist. However, that wasn't something that was manifest or evidenced through any of the group sessions we had across demographics, white, Black, Latino, Asian. And they certainly had latitude and the opportunity to express that. That was not a shared perspective in any of the groups. While I think it's important to note that while the groups felt that the fire department is not a racist organization, they did feel as though there were individuals who are racist inside the organization, and they'd like for those individuals to be held accountable for those individual actions because they feel like they don't represent the fire department as a whole. There are some tensions that exist, especially cultural, and it's due to the fact that you have individuals coming from different demographics of the community and the county that don't always receive probably the type of integration that would foster cultural competency. And we have some recommendations about that inside that particular section of the report. Next slide, please. So there's a perception within the fire department that there is no racism. So it's an interesting piece. You had some folks who highlighted they felt that was the case. You had some people who also felt that it was not the case. And once again, across Black, white, Latino, Asian. And so one of the things that they were most concerned about, and this went across all the groups, is that they were concerned that the fire department, along with the city, hadn't done enough to tell its own story about the great things that happened in the department. This was shared across almost every group. They wanted folks to talk not just about the thing, not in a way that responded just to the negative things that were being portrayed. They wanted folks to talk about all the positive things that are ongoing inside the department, the things that distinguish them as a premier fire service, and they had great pride in that particular piece. So one of the things that they wanted to do was to look at the demographic makeup, the number of shifts, the number of fire personnel and fire stations, all needed to address fire safety, and then see if there was any way that those demographics could be integrated into decision maker into the future, especially considering the way personnel is staffed throughout the community, throughout the city, especially in African American communities. Next slide. I mentioned that there were issues about holding each other accountable. That's not only just from issues involving race, but also on issues involving how they relate to one another, some allegations of hazing, etc. They want folks to be held accountable for that, and so that that brush doesn't go across whole organization. It's specific to individuals who violate the policies and the practices. There was some concerns about inequity of treatment in discipline and corrective actions based upon the race. And a lot of those racial tensions, however, are driven in part by the Facebook postings. Some people want to say that their First Amendment rights are impacted if you don't allow them to say what's on their mind. However, they don't realize that what they consider to be freedom of speech, their intent, doesn't always align with the impact of those actions when it comes to their fellow staff members. Next slide, please. So I'm going to transition here to Mr. Ratchford. He will start us off with the recommendations.
And before I talk to you all about the recommendations, I want to just quickly go back to the last bullet point on the previous slide regarding Facebook. And as we thought about this, if you think about the way EEO looks at harassment, be it sexual harassment or racial harassment, if I harass a fellow employee away from the job, I'm at home and that person is at home, it doesn't matter that I did this away from the job or I did it at home. In effect, what I've done is create a hostile work environment for my coworker when that person has to report the work the next day. And that's one of the reasons that we would say that you all perhaps need to look at, and not specifically Facebook, but your social media policy to see how you might address that. But we'll talk more about that later.
Before we move forward, really quickly, you gentlemen mentioned social media policy, and I know we've recently implemented a new social media policy in light of these comments that have come forward. Mr. DeCane, do you want to touch that really quickly, please?
Yes, sir, Chairman. Thank you. So in light of the incidents that brought some of this effort forward, we revised the fire department's policy to almost mirror that of the police department. So it provides for more accountability and ensures that there's no direct connection between their profession and what they're posting and representing the city.
Very good. So regarding recommendations, and as we indicated earlier, we have 19 of them, and I'm going to quickly go through those. So our very first recommendation is that the City of Winston-Salem and its fire department design and implement a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan. And if you already have one in place, you might want to consider updating that. We think that that's really important, and to make it citywide is really important. That you increase DEI awareness and knowledge through employee engagement. Employees should be given an opportunity to participate. They should not be forced to do so, but they should at the very least be given an opportunity to participate in these initiatives. After you've completed your DEI strategic plan, you should follow up with efforts on a community-wide initiative, because this is not just about the Winston-Salem Fire Department or the City of Winston-Salem. This is also about all of the residents of the City of Winston-Salem, and everybody having a say and everybody owning this process of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We also suggest that, recommend that you look at creating community forums to bring residents together for deliberative community dialogues on tough issues and community concerns. And not only about the Winston-Salem Fire Department, but any issue that may be based upon the identity of any group within the City of Winston-Salem. Next slide, please. That you increase outreach to diverse populations in Winston-Salem. And there are many ways of looking at diversity when you consider diverse populations. You have something that we call primary dimensions of diversity. And those are things that you're born with and over which you have no control. Then you have secondary dimensions of diversity, and those are things that we as human beings have some control over. And so what it means, I can have a group of all women, but there's still great diversity within that group. or a group of all men, and there's still great diversity in that group when I look at those secondary dimensions of diversity. That the DEI training be provided on a continuous basis. You can't do this one time and think, okay, we've done our job, now we can put this on the shelf and allow it to collect dust. This needs to become part of standard operating procedure, and it needs to as long as the city of Winston-Salem is in existence, this type of training and initiative should also be a part of that existence. That you provide, and we think this is really important, that you provide funding to the fire department to have 4 fire and life safety educators who will take the lead on community engagement initiatives, including actions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and especially the community conversations, which might include coordination on job fairs and fire education to community groups and to neighborhoods. And this will be pretty much like the staff that you all have with the police department who are engaged in community policing. You would do essentially the same types of things with your fire department. The fire department, in lieu of all that has happened over the past year or so, absolutely should be reaching out to the community and sharing its story. Next slide, please. Okay. That you provide intercultural training for all staff of the fire department. And as Dr. Wade had indicated earlier, quite frankly, you have a situation where your employment pool for fire, you end up hiring a lot of African Americans from the inner city, and then you hire a lot of whites from the rural towns that surround Winston-Salem, and the cultures are very different. And these guys go through some really great fire training, but they don't go through training which says, this is how we need to get along, or this is what I understand about your culture, and you should understand about my culture. Again, that leads to good relationship building, and it just makes the conversation around race much easier, and it provides an opportunity for folk to get along along lines of race that they may not have done heretofore. That you ramp up the public relations and public service announcements and internal communications. Again, that goes back to the Winston-Salem Fire Department telling their story. And we're not suggesting that if groups in the community are referring to the department as being racist, or the chief as being racist, that you try to counter that. Set that aside, and you've got a lot of great stories to tell. And we want you to just be telling those stories all along, so that when things that are contrary to that come up, people have an opportunity to make their own decisions about what they believe. Mm-hmm. That you be more intentional about diverse shifts across all shifts in firehouses. And we recognize that in order for that to happen, you're going to have to look at the number of minorities within the fire department and think about ways that you might increase those numbers so that you might have diverse shifts across diverse shifts in diverse firehouses. Mm-hmm. Next slide, please. That you conduct a discipline audit at the Winston-Salem Fire Department. As Dr. Wade had mentioned earlier in the assessment, there was a great deal of talk by both Black and white firefighters that if a fire personnel came up for discipline, the discipline that you might get very often was dependent upon your race, and and we don't know that that's true or not, because again, we did not do an investigation, but we absolutely think that that's something that you all need to check into to make sure that it's not true. And if it's true, you change it. And if it's not true, then you get word out into the community when you share your stories about how this is not happening. That you also conduct a demographics audit of the Winston-Salem Fire Department by positions. And you want to see if the numbers in terms of people of color are representative of those numbers of the demographics of the city of Winston-Salem. That you revisit and strengthen, and this should have said, instead of the city's Facebook policy, the social media policy, and Damon has already spoken to that. That the chief and his executive team be willing to have what we call the talk with fire personnel. And this means them taking an opportunity to just sit down one-on-one, or maybe in small groups, to have honest conversation about what they feel, about what fire staff feel about race, the issue of race within the fire department. There's nothing wrong with sitting down and having the talk in the very same way that a lot of Black families have to have the talk with their children before they get out into the world. Next slide, please. That you review and assess all administrative policies and use a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens to update those policies and procedures. That you designate DEI staff oversight. And this means that if you're really going to be serious about diversity, equity, and inclusion, there should be some executive who is reporting to the city manager and who is in charge of making sure that that all city departments, including the fire department, is involved in this work. And then also, finally, that the Winston-Salem Fire Department develop and implement an anti-hazing policy because in speaking to staff, we did get the impression that that there's some hazing that goes on in the department, and there were some African Americans who indicated that there were times that the hazing may have taken on some racial overtones. And again, this goes back to that intent versus impact. And while you might be hazing someone as a way of having fun, which is your intent to get a good laugh, the impact is that it may be perceived as being racist by the person who is on the other end of that hazing. Again, keeping in mind that like sexual harassment, racial harassment lies in the eyes of the beholder. With that, we will now answer any questions that you guys might have.
Before you move away from that, I just wanted to add one final point. And that was that you have many fine things working for you in terms of your staff. We've already mentioned Ms. Adams and her involvement going forward with continuation of DEI training, those types of awareness issues. You've also got a human resources department as well as a human relations department, and both of those are charged with also with DEI. And so those are two internal resources along with Ms. Adams that will certainly assist you as moving down this path.
Dr. Wade, I want to thank you for this presentation. Ms. Francesca Adams, thank you for the presentation as well. I know you guys have spent countless months, countless hours and days putting this together. So we will review your recommendations and we will do what we can to try to make as many adjustments as possible. Members of the committee and council, this has probably been the longest presentation that we've had, but rightfully so. These allegations were something we needed to look into, so we wanted to give the full report and then kick it to you for questions, recommendations, or concerns. Councilman Mundy, I saw your hand.
Yes, before we move on to other business, I want to make sure as we look at DEI that although this has clearly been a racial issue, we must include sexual orientation and gender identity. We've had some very recent occurrences of homophobia in the city, not internal, but external, but we need to be part of the solution to that. So everything that we do with DEI, we must bake in all groups of people, and very intentionally.
Excellent point.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Councilwoman Burke.
Thank you, Chairman Taylor. Thank you, Dr. Wade, Mr. Ratchford, and Ms. Adams. This was an outstanding, excellent, much needed presentation. And you highlighted many areas where I believe we need to have a laser focus. I think that you said in your presentation, and I'm going to agree with you, that from your assessment that the city of Winston-Salem should move forward with a standard operation in this city for DEI. I believe that we need a citywide DEI office. I believe that we need this infrastructure, even if it means restructuring one of the offices that we currently have. We need to have an office that specifically focuses on, as Mr. Mundy said, sexual orientation when it comes to our employees, hiring practices, retention, promotion, race relations, recruitment, and practices for within our organization. We can't just stop at where we just only focus on the fire department, as you said, and we need to focus on the city. So we need to have a citywide DEI program, and this is on par with what many other cities are already doing. For example, just to name a few, we have DEI offices in Atlanta, Durham, and even Gastonia. And they're not as large as the city of Winston-Salem. And so it is a much needed office. And I really thank you all for your presentation. Outstanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Burke. We'll add that to our list of recommendations to consider as we move forward. We appreciate that suggestion. Is there anyone else who wishes to be heard on this item? Councilwoman Scipio.
I guess I will never let the opportunity pass when it comes down to what this city is about and should be about, not just the governmenting part of it, but what this community of Winston-Salem is. We have been a very progressive city historically. Before most cities thought about inclusion, there were efforts back in the 30s and the 40s. This is who we are. But sometimes as you age and as you move along and you got different generations, we forget where we came from and we forget about the struggles. We forgot how we overcame. But you know, the most important thing is relationships. How do we really respect and love each other? And we can put many programs in place, but number one, we must model it from the top. From the very seat of government, we must model that respect for each other, and we must do what it takes to build positive relationships. And sometimes it's as simple as saying good morning and smiling and saying, I like you, I appreciate you. You know, people are now all about bringing their baggage to a table. Nobody needs your baggage. That's your stuff, but you can carry it with you or you can leave it behind. And so I love the fact that, Mr. City Manager, I want to congratulate you for moving forward and having an outside person or group to investigate this, because the charges were horrific. But I knew in my heart of hearts that we have so many good people who are working for this city, who are in our public safety areas, our fire department and our police department. But I am certainly, if it had been different, I would be very much an advocate of let's correct it. But what we need to do now is, I agree, we build on what we are about. We are about loving people. And more importantly, respect for each other. That's number one. And we must be loving to each other. So thank you very much for this, this report. And I would certainly be in agreement with moving forward with many of those recommendations. Some of them are just simple, very easy to do. It's just what people should do. And that's called respecting and love each other. Thank you.
Thank you to members of the council, members of the committee, to those in WPR Consulting that made this happen. I will say, as we said in the presentation, everyone has had the opportunity who wanted to come forward to come forward. We take allegations of racism extremely serious, especially considering the climate in America today. We want to make sure we're leading from the top and leading from the front. And as the gentleman mentioned, if you want to come forward to say something, you still have the opportunity to do that. Our hearts and our minds will always be open. We will hear you and we will make the appropriate adjustments and recommendations. With that being said, is there anyone else? Okay, Councilman Larson. You're on mute, sir.
Mr. Taylor, if no one else wants to say anything, if I might have 15 to 30 seconds. Dr. Wade and I have been doing this work for.
Rashford, let me get you to hold on.
Am I muted?
No, if you.
Okay, go right ahead.
You can hear me. I want to get you on for one moment. Councilman Larson has been recognized, and I'll come up.
Yes, I would appreciate some clarity as to who they contact. This is going to be going public rather rapidly, and a lot of people don't even know this was going on. And I think it would be useful if there are people out there that still feel, particularly retired firemen or what have firefighters, that they knew that they had an opportunity still to have their voice heard. Who do they talk to on that? Who do they actually call, or how's that arranged?
Mr. DeCane.
Yes, sir. Councilmember Larson, our entire fire department workforce was sent an email by me with Ms. Francesca Adams' contact information. They can go through her. If there's anyone else outside of the organization, they can find me. They can easily find me on the website and contact me directly.
Contact Assistant City Manager Damon Duquesne.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
And for clarity, Mr. Larson, there should not be anybody in the fire department who was not aware that this assessment was going on. If we find that's the case, you do have the ability to come forward, and we'll make sure Mr. DeCane reaches back out again. Mr. Rashford. Mr. Rashford, you have the floor, sir.
He appears to be frozen.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll move to the next item, and Mr. Rashford and Dr. Wade, we will come back to you if necessary, but hopefully you can stand by. So next item, please.
Thank you.
Item G3, information regarding the gun crime reduction unit for the Winston-Salem Police Department.
Slogan forward, we'll kick it to you to cue up the item.
Thank you, Chairman Taylor, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the committee and council. The next item before you is involving the Winston-Salem Police Department and the establishment of a new task force entitled the Gun Crime Reduction Unit. As you're getting the one calls that come through, you may have noticed this acronym GCREW being used, responding when we have shootings that are occurring in the community. So we wanted to provide an opportunity for the department to update you on the work of this task force. And I would ask Assistant Chief Weaver if he would handle this presentation, please.
Chief Weaver, you have the floor, sir.
Yes, good evening, Chair Taylor, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, other members of the Public Safety Committee. Happy New Year. I am W.S. Weaver II, Assistant Police Chief of the Winston-Salem Police Department Patrol and Special Operations Divisions. With me tonight are Captain Renee Melly, who's our District 2 current commander. She's here virtually in our virtual community. Additionally, to my right is newly promoted Captain Ed Branshaw, who will be transitioning with Captain Melly into the District 2 command position, remembering that District 2 covers the vast majority of the Northeast Ward, the East Ward, as well as the Southeast Ward. Captain Melly, who actually initiated the GCREW unit, will now be transitioning to our Support Services Bureau, and she will be commanding our training, recruiting, and court liaison functions. As you know, our city, as well as our state and our country, are experiencing large amounts of gun-related violence. In fact, firearm-related violence is the #1 challenge for the Winston-Salem Police Department as a professional law enforcement agency, as well as the other major cities across North Carolina and actually across the United States. In an effort to reduce our firearm-related violence, the Winston-Salem Police Department has initiated the Gun Crime Reduction Unit, or as we call it, GCREW. GCREW is assigned to our patrol division, and we'll be briefing this committee and our citizens on this initiative tonight. Next slide, please. The purpose of our Gun Crime Reduction Unit is to reduce the gun crime incidents that are occurring across the city. Our Gun Crime Reduction Unit, or GCREW, will respond to and investigate gun crimes involving the discharging of firearms, whether that discharge of the firearm is into a dwelling, a vehicle, or they'll also investigate incidents where an actual individual has been injured by gunfire. GCREW will also assist in the apprehension of violent offenders where our SWAT team has not assumed the apprehension, and GCREW will engage in proactive policing in those areas where gun violence has repeatedly occurred. Next slide, please. Go ahead.
Good evening.
And just as an introduction, let me introduce Lieutenant Scott Wright. He is the operational field commander for the GCREW unit.
Good evening. GCREW's impact on firearm-related incidents At the peak of this in the summer, when we started in July, we had 273 reported incidents at that time. Immediately, G Crew was able to have a reduction in discharging firearms into an occupied dwelling and or vehicle throughout the month of August. As we moved into September, we saw another 10% reduction in those types of calls, and then another 20% reduction as we moved into October. As of this slide being created in December, the overall impact of G Crew from July through the end of 2020, we saw an overall 20% reduction in firearm-related offenses. Next slide. From July to December 14, 2020, G Crew made a total of 884 arrests. Of those 884 arrests, 675 of those were felony arrests. That's a significant amount of arrests that are in the felony category that required a lot of time by all of our officers involved. We made 133 misdemeanor arrests and wrote 76 citations. Next slide. G Crew seizures from July through December 14th. The total value of all their seizures were well over $100,000 in value. Of significance on all those seizures, we seized 54 firearms. Next slide. G Crew has assisted several other entities within the police department during this time. We've arrested individuals responsible for over 14 firearm-related incidents in the Cleveland Avenue, Holmes, Farrell Court, and Castle Heights neighborhood. We're also able to assist in locating 6 juvenile offenders who were also involved in firearm-related incidents. We have assisted in several firearm investigations that led to search warrants being obtained for residents, resulting in the seizure of firearms and narcotics. We've also assisted our criminal investigation division in locating a suspect responsible for at least 4 robberies of local businesses. And by locating that vehicle, we're also able to help assist in developing a suspect for those robberies. Next slide.
Let me go back and mention one other aspect. I know that quite often you hear us discussing through our one calls several different units that may be involved in some of the gun violence that's occurring. So just to give an understanding of what's going on, WSPD has several units that investigate firearm-related crimes. We have a street crimes unit, or 3 actually. Each WSPD district is assigned a street crime unit, which is responsible for the concentrated enforcement of street-level crimes that occur of all types throughout each district. That may be, in most cases, drug-type offenses occurring in neighborhoods. It also can extend to breakings into homes, breakings into vehicles. We're having an uprise in catalytic converter thefts that are going on, so those street crime units can be used to handle the different types of street crime in each district. Additionally, we have a gang unit. Our gang unit's responsible for conducting investigations which involve gangs, gang-related crimes or activity, and they also provide intelligence on some of the gang members that are being investigated throughout our agency. Of course, we have a SWAT team, which is responsible for handling various high-risk law enforcement incidents, such as barricaded subjects, hostage rescues, high-risk arrests, and they also conduct dignitary protection when we have dignitaries in our city. Our criminal investigations division, they have the primary responsibility for the major crime solution, which includes the investigations of homicides, robberies, burglaries, things along those lines. And then, as this committee knows, as well as City Council, back in 2018, the Violent Firearm Investigations Team, or what we call VFIT, was also created. And they are responsible for significantly reducing the level of gun violence by conducting in-depth criminal investigations of gun-related crime. The difference between VFIT is that VFIT are assigned to our detective division, and they conduct in-depth investigations of gun crime, which can lead to successful prosecution at both the state and the federal level. G Crew is out at night as these incidents are occurring, immediately responding, and as they respond, is a unit that's sufficient in numbers enough that they can take over the perimeter aspects, processing the scenes, and do all the things we need to do, including interviewing witnesses and conducting further aspects of the investigation, so that those aspects are at least taken care of. And if they can't close the case, then it may be transitioned towards the violent firearms investigative team in our criminal investigations division. Chair, that's all we have at this point. This item is for information only. We are here to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you all for the presentation. They adequately explained G Crew, Street Crimes Gang Unit, Criminal Investigations, and VFIT. There's a lot of acronyms, so I'd ask that, Chief Weaver, if you would just get us a memo, just kind of briefly discussing each particular unit so that we could have it as a reference. And members of the committee, is there anything that you need to discuss regarding this item? Councilman Larson, and then we'll go to Councilwoman Scipio. You're on mute, sir.
Thank you for that briefing, and thank you for the work that your department's doing to reduce gun violence in the city. Can you give me any statistic about two things that are of interest to me? One is how many weapons have been seized in this last year that involve gun violence? And I think last year we got a report of several hundred weapons that had been taken by the police out of circulation off the streets. And the second thing that I'm kind of curious about is I get a lot of reports about shootings in our city. A lot of them do not result ultimately in a death, but in a wounded individual going to the hospital. It's not life-threatening. And I'm kind of curious about these people that are going to a hospital wounded, shot up in the arms, legs, what have you, have been violently treated with a weapon. And I'm just kind of curious, do we keep some statistics on the number of individuals that go to our hospitals with wounds, gunshot wounds, or do the police department understand that they are notified anytime somebody comes into a hospital with a gunshot wound, that they're notified about that? But do we have any idea just how many, not homicides, not actual deaths, but actual guns casualties, as it were, within the city? And is that a statistic that we keep?
Yes, sir, Councilmember Larson. Let me answer your first question related to the number of seizures. In both 2019 and in 2020, WSPD seized over 1,000 weapons each year related to gun violence or illegal gun activity. Does that answer that portion of your question?
Yes, that's excellent. That's a lot of guns, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
And we have to store those. We can't destroy those or dispose of those. Is that correct? We're storing those in a warehouse somewhere?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And because the state doesn't allow us to destroy those weapons.
Yes, sir, that's correct. And we can talk offline if we need to about what actually the other things that are holding us up from destroying those weapons.
Right. Thank you. What about the other question? Are you able to give me any statistics on that at all?
I don't have the exact numbers right now. I don't believe, Lieutenant Wright, do you have numbers? At this point, yes, we do keep a type of statistic related to the number of people that are actually reported to be shot. As you know, through some of our one calls, you understand that whether they show up at the hospital or whether we actually end up with them out on a scene somewhere, sometimes they cooperate with us and tell us what we need to know to try and solve that crime. Other times people will not cooperate with us for one reason or another. And we're still trying to determine who the actual shooters are, where these guns are coming from, and things along those lines, keeping in mind that not only is WSPD working with this, but we're also engaged very heavily with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Explosives as our federal partners who are also assisting us. If you'll remember when we initiated VFIT, they were assisting us with the acquisition of the NIBIN, the National Integrated Ballistics Investigative Network, that tool, so that we are better able to track some of the gun violence incidents that are going on across our city, as well as across the state and the country with some of the firearms that are being utilized.
Thank you. I'm anxious to follow these topics and perhaps have semi-annual report or something about how we're doing with our gun violence teams. I think it's a pivotal question right now in the city, and I think there's a lot of interest in what efforts we're taking to solve it. So thank you for this report.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Mr. Larson, for the question.
One more addition, please, Chair, if you don't mind.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. We had over 70-some people actually report that they were shot during 2020 at this point. And additionally, our main statistics will come out a little bit later on in the spring, but we'll be sure to put out an addendum, so to speak, of what has happened with both our violent firearms investigations team as well as our G Crew team.
And out of that number, we had what, 28 homicides? What was our final death count?
So I believe our final number was 28 homicides for the year, which was actually down from the previous year.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And because our meeting is running a little long, we'll just ask that you submit that information to us. We'll review it and we'll bring you back. You're here every month and twice a month sometimes. So we'll see you on the next go around. Thank you for the presentation. And Councilmember Larson, we'll get that information to you. Now, the next item we certainly need to move to because they've been extremely patient and we've given them the opportunity to come and present. Councilwoman Scipio, did you want to add something before we move forward?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just want to say thank you to Assistant Chief Weaver and the whole Winston-Salem PD staff. I am the council member who actually lives in the neighborhoods that have been ravished with the gun violence and not being able to sleep at night because of all of the shootings that go on. I thank you very much. It has been quiet for a bit of time now. Since this team has been in place, and my neighbors are sleeping better. I'm sleeping better, but it is not a very nice thing to be living where people believe they have the freedom to disturb your peace and your safety. So I am certainly very happy that we have moved forward in the Winston-Salem Police Department to put in the resources that we need to make our neighborhoods safe for all the people, because we do have bad actors who do not want to follow the rules. So thank you very much, Chief Weaver and the Winston-Salem PD. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Scipio. We'll move to item G4, please.
Item G4, Triad Abolition Project presentation.
Members of the council and committee, on multiple occasions, we've had members of our community with the Triad Abolition Project to come forward during the public comment period and offer many suggestions and recommendations on how we should conduct public safety. I want to take an opportunity to let them know that we take them seriously. And as Councilwoman Burke, the previous Councilwoman Burke would say, this is the people's house and everybody has an opportunity, should be heard equally. So you have the floor. We want to give you an opportunity to give your presentation and then we'll talk a little bit about the results. You have the floor.
Thank you, Councilman Taylor, for inviting us. Just to clarify, so to introduce myself first, my name is Dr. Brittany Battle. I am a faculty member at Wake Forest in the sociology department. I'm also a founding member of Triad Abolition Project. Tonight, we're speaking on behalf of the Forsyth County Police Accountability and Reallocation Coalition, which is a coalition made up of a number of grassroots organizations in Winston-Salem and Forsyth County, not just Triad Abolition Project. So it includes my organization, Hate Out of Winston, NC-SPAN, the Democratic Socialists of America, Drum Majors Alliance, Forsyth County Community Bail Fund, and Forsyth County Court Support. I originally was just going to field questions this evening after my colleagues presented, but I do want to make one point before I pass it over to Miranda Jones. At this point, it would be professional malpractice for me as a social scientist with a PhD in sociology from a top-tier research institution and training in issues of race and racism to not speak, just to make a quick comment about the presentation that we saw earlier. I highly respect the work that was done by these gentlemen investigating the issues of racism in the Winston-Salem Fire Department, but I have to let you all know that there is a plethora of social science literature indicating that racial and gender representation in institutions does not negate racism or sexism in those institutions. institutions. White supremacy, racism, and sexism exist in institutions without any individual actors behaving in a particular way. And in 2021, it would be very dangerous for us to allow that claim to go forth. And so there are a number of books. I will hold them up so you can see. These are books that I just pulled off of my shelf really quickly that I highly recommend everyone check out for you to understand how racism works in the United States without racist actors, overt racist actors, and in a system that is purported to be colorblind. So I thought that was really important to start with. I'll turn it over to Miranda now.
Your point is well taken, ma'am.
Greetings and good evening, Councilmember Taylor and members of City Council. Thank you for providing us your constituent space on the agenda to discuss the demands that we have pushed for at each City Council meeting since late last year. We recognize that 10 minutes is not enough time to explicate our demands, so we will provide them in brief. Before we do that, it is incumbent upon us to address the events of January 6th, where white supremacist domestic terrorists staged a failed coup on America. It is alarming to us that our local representatives have not officially repudiated these actions, particularly our white city council reps. We also took note of the response of law enforcement in opening the gates and some standing passively by or taking selfies with terrorists. We have read reports of off-duty North Carolina police officers being present on Capitol Hill that day and know that buses left from Winston-Salem to take residents to participate in the insurrection that day. So we challenge you to root out all the white supremacist elements in law, in the law enforcement agency and all other departments here in Winston-Salem. We recognize that no demand will be effective if local law enforcement remains permeated with white supremacists. We ask that you begin this process immediately. As a matter of public safety. Lastly, we are optimistic about the mental health crisis response team because we see that you've looked at the research we provided. We have been diplomatic and prudent, yet our fight starts at our front door and ends at your front door. Next, I present Neil Sadler and Allie Jones of the Forsyth County Police Accountability and Reallocation Coalition.
Good evening. If you don't mind, please go into the next slide. All right, so tonight I'm here to talk about our demands. We have been pursuing reallocation of 10% of the Winston-Salem Police Department's $78 million budget since this summer. Reallocation is not the outlandish demand of a group of ragtag radicals, as my comrade Miranda Jones calls us. This is a realistic shifting of priorities from a system that punishes people of color for their very existence while condoning white violence on a daily basis. This is a change away from funding systems that are reactionary to systems that are preventative. It is wonderful to get guns off the street, but it's better to avoid the shootings to begin with. The police do not stop crime. They show up after crimes have been committed. We are seeking to fund initiatives that prevent the bulk of crime from occurring to begin with. We have 6 areas that need support with the reallocation of police funds, most germane to your committee. If you could please go to the next slide. We ask for the implementation and support of a violence interrupters program. One more, please. Thank you. We recognize that gun violence is a very serious issue. And while there are volunteer citizens who are engaged in violence interruption and mediation here in Winston, they lack support. And so we know that national programs such as Cure Violence and Youth Alive, when partnered with appropriate funding and city commitment, have been shown to give a dramatic impact on decreasing not just the amount of gun violence, but also the costs associated with said violence. And they go into cities, they work with people to remove guns, to mediate causes, and they also go in, Councilman Larson had addressed the people who are not killed, but actually end up in the hospital. And these programs, these violence interrupter programs, go meet with people who are victims of gun violence to help mediate and resolve things before they are released and avoid return to conflict. So while we do not have a figure for what violence interruption programs would cost our city, in 2018, the governor of Maryland approved a $5 million bill to fund violence interruption programs in their state. Next slide, please. We seek this is what reallocation has looked like in other cities. I think the committee has this slideshow, so I will ask for the next slide, please. Thank you. We seek an overall $2.5 million increase in the budget for the Department of Rehabilitation and Youth Services. $1 million would go to the Successful Outcomes After Release SOAR program, and $1.5 million would go to the Youth Build program. Both programs are grateful to the support of Councilmember Taylor, who has championed their work for a good reason. Part of the $5 million violence interruption funds distributed by the state of Maryland supported youth engagement programs such as Youth Build, with the focus of placing people in productive environments. Currently, each program is only able to run one cycle annually because they cannot operate concurrently due to a lack of sufficient staff. Youth Build struggles to maintain a construction educator due to the non-competitive wage that is offered for that position, and they do not currently fulfill the promises and resources of the national program. When operating under the $1.5 million Department of Labor grant, Youth Build was able to provide each participant with 1 full year of follow-up support, as well as a consistent case manager who was there to support navigation of obstacles to engagement. It is absolutely unacceptable to offer a national program without fulfilling all the facets of its design. The Public Safety Committee has had no problem approving grants that contribute to the militarization of WSPD, despite the fact that when these grants run out, the city will be on the hook for those expenditures. Programs like SOAR and Youth Build each serve less than 10% of eligible residents. We urge you to please stop approving grants that support non-Winston residents and invest in programs that provide productive activity for people at risk of committing crime or being arrested, and that will contribute to the city's economy by creating successfully employed tax-paying citizens, not police officers who go home to Kernersville, Clemens, or High Point. In addition to the items under the purview of your committee, we seek an increase in the minimum wage for all city residents. We demand an increase in the accessibility of public transit. And finally, we ask for forgivable loans for all Black business. We appreciate that this committee has the power to meet the funding demands of violence interrupters, SOAR, and Youth Build. And we implore you to not only make the best decisions for our residents here, but vote yes overall when reallocation for these other 3 areas is on the table. I will now pass the mic to Ms. Nia Sadler.
Thank you, Allie. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you about Civilian Police Oversight Authority for WSPD and FCSO. Next slide, please. Yes, so despite their authority, community review boards are often ineffective because politicians purposefully stop the meaningful carrying out of these boards through the following impediments. So politicians create CRBs that are not independent from police. Past or present police employees staff CRBs. Municipalities don't bestow CRBs with a subpoena power, and there's inadequate funding. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to be effective, you need subpoena power, broad scope of investigation, transparency, independence from police, meaningful disciplinary power, and a budget. Next slide, please. Thanks. So in Winston-Salem, the Citizens Police Review Board serves as an advisory board to the City Manager and Public Safety Committee. The board reviews citizens' requests for appeals of the police chief's decision regarding complaints against the police department employees, and it determines the necessity of a hearing and, when necessary, conducts appeals hearings, which include receiving and evaluating testimony and issuing findings of facts to the city manager for action and the Public Safety Committee for its information. The board receives and reviews a summary of internal and externally made complaints against an officer and may also perform other duties as assigned. So ours is not independent because of legality's close association with WSPD and the Forsyth County DA's office. Next slide, please. And our demands follow similar ones from Fayetteville and under the guidance of National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. And those boards act on behalf of citizens and take a comprehensive approach to things like hiring practices and pay, training, use of demeaning or disrespectful language, adherence to body cam policy, use of excessive force, and independent investigation of misconduct allegations. Next slide, please. So now it's about the creating mental health crisis intervention mobile unit. Next slide, please. So I'm going to highlight 2 bullets here. So individuals with severe mental illness generate no less than 1 in 10 calls for police services and occupy at least 1 in 5 of America's prison or jail beds. The next bullet that I want to highlight is that data suggests that people with disabilities or mental health diagnoses are more likely to be victims of excessive force and more likely to be killed if they are Black or brown. Next slide, please. And this is a quote that we have, oh no, we've all heard since the summer. Our chief of police said, we're expected to be everything: teachers, babysitters, healthcare workers, mental health providers. Oh, and by the way, handling crime as well. I'd be happy to reallocate our funding into those programs or into those people or orgs that can provide those things. And then Councilmember Jeff McIntosh is quoted in the Journal agreeing that more spending on mental health is needed, but that it's not a city function. It's true that majority of the mental health treatment has private or state or federal funding, but there's no rule that says we can't invest in mental health as a city. So in Greensboro, since 2019, Greensboro has contracted an independent company to assist police in responding to calls that are mental health related issues and send trained counselors to address those problems. And Winston-Salem can do that too. And in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, they approved $2.4 million to be reallocated from the police budget to a non-police 911 mental health resource unit. Next slide, please. Thank you. So it appears that our coalition and WSPD have parallels in our research. So we've got cahoots on our agenda too, and so do they. So you might hear some overlap in our research. So I'm optimistic that since they have that research as well, that we can enact a program sooner rather than later. So Cahoots is the crisis assistance helping out on the streets. It's based in Eugene, Oregon, and the origin is in 1989. And it provides a mental health first response for crises involving mental illness, houselessness, and addiction. And it's a two-person team consisting of a medic and a crisis worker who have training in the mental health field. They deal with conflict resolutions, welfare checks, substance abuse, suicide threats, and more through trauma-informed de-escalation and harm reduction techniques. They're not law enforcement. They don't carry weapons. They use nonviolent resolutions of crisis situations. And it's funded by the city of Eugene. So last year, out of roughly 24,000 Cahoots calls, police backup was only requested 150 times. Yeah, so out of all of those calls, that tiny amount needed to police backup. So the next slide, please. Thank you. This figure shows that in 2017, Cahoots answered 17% of their police department's overall call volume, and the program has saved the city an estimated $8.5 million in public safety spending since 2014. Again, WSPD also has information about Cahoots and Greensboro in their presentation, so I'm excited to see that maybe we can do the same thing or similar things. These are just 3 of our demands, but thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, ladies. Members of the committee and council, discussion or conversation based off the presentation. Councilman Larson.
I don't think there's been any question about the amount of energy and time that our local police have undertaken to deal with issues dealing with mental health, particularly since so many of the facilities were emptied out by previous administrations, turning them out onto the streets. I think the real question that I'm grappling with is the responsibility for public health residing within the county and our police force, which patrols within the city boundaries themselves, and how we would orchestrate a coordinated effort to address this problem. I'm not sure that we can relegate it entirely to mental health experts to respond to every call that appears to have mental health issues to it without a police backup, at least, or capabilities, because we don't know oftentimes what you're getting into when you respond to these calls. So I think there's a piece of work to be done trying to understand a little bit more about the interface between bringing mental health expertise into the discussion, into the support team, how that's to be funded. I appreciate the commentary about defunding or reallocating is a better word, I guess, funding out of the police department. However, I'm not entirely sure what is being proposed to be cut to warrant that reallocation of money. I haven't really heard that from your group. as to what functions are currently being performed by the police that you're willing to diminish within our current environment. I not think there's a question that we need to supplement certain activities dealing with social services to address this problem, which festers within the police department itself. And I'm sure they're anxious to divest themselves of it. But until we devise a system to do that, I guess I'm reluctant to simply say we're going to take money away from the police and throw it toward a program that may involve county support as well. I'm happy to have a response to that. I mean, if somebody from the group would like to.
So,
Battle, did you want to briefly address Councilmember Larson's question?
yeah, so just to respond, a number of the things that we're proposing, including the CAHOOTS program and having the mental health rapid response team, if you look at the data around that program in Eugene, Oregon, you find a multi-million-dollar reduction in budget because it's a cost-saving mechanism. And so there are ways to respond to things in more appropriate ways without having police, which the data also show us that in mental health calls, just the presence of a police officer has resulted in the escalation of the incident. And so I do understand that there are potentially incidents where some backup may be necessary, but as Ms. Sadler just presented, the research that we have about programs that already exist, these are not things that we're, creating from, proposing to create from scratch in Winston. The data that we have about these programs that already exist demonstrate that police officer backup are not needed in the vast majority of these calls, that the mental health worker is able to de-escalate the incident without there being any violence, and that when a police officer does arrive, that is what escalates the incident. And so also, as we mentioned, as Ms. Jones mentioned in her component of the presentation, cities across the country, including right here in North Carolina and Asheville, have been doing the work of reallocating dollars from the public safety budget to shift the way that we handle the issue of public safety in those places. And so we need to be creative about where that money can come from and how that can be done. Cities across the country with much higher crime rates, violent crime rates, much larger populations than us have been doing this, as well as cities that are smaller than us. So this is not a radical proposition. This is something that's being done across the country.
Follow up just on that a little bit.
One follow-up question, then Councilmember Burke has been waiting to be recognized.
Let Councilmember Burke take I yield to Councilmember Burke. Councilmember Burke.
Thank you, Chair Taylor and Councilmember Larson. First of all, I just wanted to say to the Triad Abolition Project, thank you for this presentation. Thank you for the time that you put into it. I want to focus specifically on mental health because it is a issue of concern that I have. And I am very interested in knowing a little bit more about the CAHOOTS program. It has sparked my interest because it is a cost-saving mechanism and because it provides the opportunity for someone who is struggling with a mental health issue to be able to get the help that they need. So this is something that has definitely sparked my interest and I would like to know more about it. Thank you.
Councilwoman Burke, actually the next item, I think we were prepared to discuss the CAHOOTS program. So what I might suggest is, that we maybe merge the two in the interest of time and just have staff give us a brief understanding of the CAHOOTS program. I suggest that, we go back, we take a look at it, come back with some action items on how we might be able to implement it. I'm sure it's going to take a little bit of creativity, but I don't think that's going to be something we're going to be able to solve tonight. So is Mr. Tesh on the line?
I am, yes, sir.
Mr. Tesh, can you talk a little bit about the CAHOOTS program?
Chairman Taylor, thank you. Mayor Pro Tem, members of the committee and council. Would you like me to speak specifically to the CAHOOTS program, or would you like me to go through the co-response and alternative response model presentation that we had for this evening?
Well, I think what's emerging is more of the mental health conversation. And I know Cahoots sort of addresses that. So we'll hold the rest of the item in committee. We'll talk specifically about this one and address any other concerns that might come up as needed. So if you just particularly talk about that one.
Okay, so Cahoots is what we will refer to as an alternative response model. I think what we see in the Triad Abolition Project folks mentioned the city of Greensboro. There are other cities, Charlotte and Raleigh in North Carolina, and many around the nation that are doing what we call a co-response model, where they send a mental health clinician with a law enforcement officer at the same time. Again, we'll call that co-response because they're going together. The Cahoots model is an alternative response model that does not include a law enforcement officer in the initial response on dispatch. So they send a mental and behavioral health clinician, as well as a nurse or an EMT in a van, essentially. And those folks are responding to mental and behavioral health calls, as well as general welfare checks, and can do some basic medical service provision as well. They can do transportation to a clinic or a hospital if the person is ambulatory and gives consent for said transit. I do have some overlap between what the previous presentation had with respect to some of the performance data with Cahoots. I will tell you that the Cahoots model, you'll see there, they cited 17% as a diversion rate. And when we talk about diversion rates, what we mean are the number of calls that would normally go to a law enforcement response versus what Cahoots would respond to. The Eugene Police Department has an estimated diversion rate of 5 to 8% instead of that 17%. And that number is cited around the idea, and both of the Whitebird Clinic, who is the service provider for Cahoots, as well as the Eugene Police Department, will tell you the program is actually so successful that people dial 911 for calls that you wouldn't normally see in other jurisdictions. And so when we say 5 to 8% diversion rate, effective diversion rate, what they're saying is 5 or 8% of their normal police calls, they would estimate, would go to Cahoots. But then there's another significant series where people actually call 911 because they know the service exists. And that's not to diminish the service that's being provided. It's just to say that there's an actual increase in the level of service provided because it's being provided that well. Again, they cited that in less than 1% of the cases to which Cahoots is a sole responder, that they have to call for law enforcement backup. I do want to mention, and we do have that 2.1 million number for expenditures, as well as the 8.5 million for law enforcement. That is not an independently verified number. That is a number that comes from the Whitebird Clinic. I know the methodology that's used to calculate those savings, and I would be very careful to say that those are fiscal impact scenario that we would realize in a next budget year. We as a city would need to look at our response model, the program itself, how it would be structured, the number of calls that would be diverted, the types of response that we would have, and how much it would cost and save us to do that. But again, I'm not sure that we would save that $6.5 million next year by simply implementing an alternative response model like Cahoots. I do want to mention, we will get to this next time. This is city information, research that we have done. I know that we intended to have some folks from RTI on here to talk about our partnership with them, but I do want to mention that this is not their research. This was city research specifically, and we will be expanding on that research and our partnership with RTI in the future. So if you have any questions about what I've presented really quickly there, I'd be more than happy to answer what staff knows about the Cahoots program or alternative response models. But again, I do want to say it's Cahoots is without law enforcement, but what you see in Greensboro, Charlotte, and Raleigh right now, what they've recently implemented are those co-response models, which includes both law enforcement and mental health clinicians responding together at the same time. Thank you.
It sounds to me that the citizens and the committee may can find some common ground on the co-response model. So I just asked staff to look at the information that was presented, the information that we have, and for a later date, maybe potentially in February, we come back to this committee and have a conversation about Cahoots and how we may or may not be able to implement that based off the facts and details that we have. Councilman Mundy, I saw your hand, sir.
Yes, and I won't prolong this much because I know we're going late. Thank you, folks, for making this presentation. I think you do have some great ideas, particularly mental health. I'm tired of hearing that our jails are filled with people who really have mental health issues more than criminal tendencies. Just in the interest of accuracy, I do want to point out that I did make a social media statement condemning the actions on January the 6th. So if you want to take a look at my Facebook page, you can see that. A couple of years ago, I think I would have been in the exact same spot as these folks who are asking us to defund the police. But in 2018, I started working with Leadership Winston-Salem part-time. I got to know so many members of the police department. I got to know Chief Katrina Thompson very well. And I had no idea at that point in time that I would be running for public office. I was so impressed with our local police, and I continue to be impressed with the Winston-Salem Police Department and the little bit I know about our sheriff's office. I think that you folks are somewhat painting our local law enforcement officers with a very broad brush. I think there's a lot of anger over the way people have been treated across the United States, and I can assure you I share that anger. But what I don't want us to do as a council, what I don't want us to do as a community, is demonize our men and women in blue who work so hard to be fair, to serve and protect on a daily basis when they face the odds of being killed every day when they go to work. I think that there's been a very large lack of respect for the work that they do. That doesn't mean that we can't make changes. And again, some of the items that you're bringing to the table they need to be implemented. I want to give you credit for that. But at the same time, I want to commend our local law enforcement for the job that they do every day. And whatever we do, we need to take them into consideration as we make decisions.
I think the purpose
the opportunity to say my piece.
Councilman, thank you for that comment, but I just
I can see you in my mirror.
Just give me one moment, please. I'll find some common ground and consensus. So I'm gonna turn it over to you in just one moment, but I will say, I think based off consensus of the committee, that we have common ground on evaluating our programs. Soaring Youth Bill, looks like we may have found common ground on looking at the community review boards. I saw some heads nodding there, and then the cahoots model. You have the floor, but just know, in the interest of time, we're going to have to wrap it up. But I promise you to be able to bring you back in February to continue this discussion to get to a resolution. You have the floor, Ms. Battle.
Annette?
Okay, there we go. Thank you. And I just want to be clear, it's important. Y'all can call me Brittany or Dr. Battle, but Miss Battle is not my proper honorific any longer. So I just want to respond to Councilmember Mundy. Thank you for that comment, but I do want to be clear, we have not painted any law enforcement agency with any brush here in this meeting tonight. We presented about demands that we have to try to make the city safer. And so there's certainly not any painting anyone with a broad brush, but I do think it's important for us to understand the system of policing, and that data show us, we cannot argue with data, that policing is a dangerous institution for Black, brown, and queer people. And so it's really important for us to make sure that we understand that. I definitely recognize that people's lives are on the line when they go to work. And we should also recognize that Black and brown and queer people's lives are on the line every day when they engage with law enforcement across the country, including in the city of Winston-Salem, including myself this summer during the protests.
Thank you, Dr. Battle. Forgive me. Councilwoman Scipio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, residents, for presenting your concerns. I believe I'm older than most of you. And with age comes a lot of experience. And in problem solving and community building, one of the things that we must do in this city is not just react to what other cities are experiencing, but to examine ourselves. How extensive is a problem in our city? And then let's work on possible solutions to that. We have many programs that are preventing crime in this city, and they've been here for many, many years, like the Boys and Girls Club. They've done an excellent job. But they may not want to expand. And I think we need to really identify what is it that we are trying to impact. And that's the situation, that's the issue. And then what are the possible solutions for our community? because it's our community that we are trying to make better. And so it's okay if we could take a piece from here, a piece from there, a piece from that, but what is going to be that impact? And let's look at some goals, some numbers. It's not like 10 people in SOAR or 10 people in SOAR or kids in youth bill. Who are we trying to impact and how much is it gonna take? Because I can tell you that one of the best things we have is not putting money behind a solution, but putting our personal energy into building people, children, and youth. And I can say that if children continue to be illiterate, they're not learning to read, to do math, to think, there are going to be problems down the road. In the state of North Carolina, since about 1918, they have looked at the reading level of Black inmates in prison. They found out that those inmates had a reading level of about 3rd grade. And since 1920, the state prison system has determined and predicted how many prisons they're going to need. So now we have children who are not reading at 3rd grade level. You can put money on the back end or you can put it on the front end. But we really need to understand the issues and all of its component pieces before we jump to a solution. I just suggested, let's examine the issues. Let's have those discussions and then come up with a comprehensive plan that's going to make a positive difference. Because it may not. Just doing something is not enough if you're not trying to solve the problem.
Excuse me, Councilmember Taylor, I just want to make one quick point, and I very rarely speak here. As an educator, one of the things that Councilmember Scipio mentioned was the correlation between incarceration and reading. That is an urban myth. So I would ask that we not say that is not grounded in fact at all. Lots of people say that, but it is absolutely untrue. And I also want to add that these programs are near and dear to me because as an educator, one of the things that I hear from the city is that we don't deal with the schools, that's a county issue. So it's very interesting to me that we're talking about reading and education when that's a common refrain, maybe not from this current city council, but we hear that a whole lot. And I would also say, particularly because I teach special education, that I see quite a few children who I believe, even though it's not my training, may be suffering from some mental health issues. This is not addressed in schools. We're not allowed to deal with that. So I just want to say, when we start talking about all that, I think we're going in another area that we don't actually, as you mentioned, Councilmember Taylor, we don't have the facts to really delve into. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that brings a valid point. At some point in time, we're going to have to focus on those things that we can find common ground on and things that we can agree on. I think we started to develop those things. So I would just ask that the citizens and the members of the council and committee just consider what can we agree on to bring back in February to find a solution. Yes, ma'am.
I would respectfully respond to Councilwoman Scipio's concerns. We do have these programs in existence for a reason, and recidivism is one of the biggest problems that our prison population faces and that criminals face in general. When people are released from prison and from incarceration, it is very, very difficult to resume life as a productive citizen. They face many obstacles between getting work and being able to access housing and resources. And when you give somebody the resources to avoid having to participate in crime again, you are making a substantial difference to keep people out of that system. And then same thing with Youth Build, what you're doing is addressing people who are in need. And again, that's why these violence interrupter programs and violence interrupter grants in other states have incorporated programs like Youth Build into their work, because it does bring young people off the street. It gets young people out of being involved in gang violence or other types of violence and gives them something productive to do that will keep our city safer, that is demonstrably useful and already in place. We are talking about building on the blocks we have, not necessarily only putting in place new items. Thank you so much for your
Thank you. So as the chairman of the committee, I'm going to take a moment of personal privilege and try to wrap this up the best that I can. And please know that I am not stomping on anyone's ability to put forth information. We have heard you all loud and clear. It sounds to me that the consensus is on looking at our programs, Soaring Youth Build, the Citizens Review Board, and then our co-response model, and we can have that conversation in February. Is there anyone who disagrees with doing that? If so, then speak up at this time, because we want to make sure everyone is heard.
So, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Larson.
I'm muted. I'm on live. I'm less concerned about policing the police. I'm not sure they're broken. What I do think is we have a number of social issues that need attention. And I'm not sure defunding the police or reallocating from the police. I'd be curious to know, in these cases where we've seen defunding or reallocation, what programs were stripped out of police departments that are being touted as models for this new method. And I'd also be curious, and maybe to the city manager, to talk a little bit about how we would incorporate a social services mental health component into our city government when mostly the county has responsibility for that aspect of life. If we're going to set up a program of mental health to support their police department's activities or relieve them of police activities, how is that structured within the county system or within our own government that would be affordable? This goes back, I think, to Monday's question about sort of how we would move this project forward if we want to address what I think is the primary issue, and that is one of mental health. And I think we're totally united that from the police perspective, as well as from the civilian perspective, the mental health is first and foremost as one of our primary issues dealing with public safety and police response. So if we could begin to look at those two questions, and I guess I would ask our speakers this evening to come back to me with some explanation as to what the fundings were reallocated to instigate these social programs and what that meant within the police department's functional aspect. And then two, how we would deal with public health within our own municipal structure right now.
Mr. Mundy, if you want to add to Councilman Larson's request, because we'll do it all at once.
Have I got the floor?
Yeah, Mr. Mundy.
Okay. On the presentation that you all gave us, the cities that have cut funding, if you could also come back with what the impact was on crime, if there wasn't a demonstrable decrease in crime, and if you have any way of knowing or finding out over what period of time they implemented these cuts, because it's difficult to implement them in a one-year period. I could see them planning out 2 to 3 to 5 years. So again, not that the premise is unreasonable, but to do that instantaneously is just difficult. So I'd like to know some information.
Dr. Battle, do you or anyone else from your group would like to be heard on those two?
We've done that research. I'm a social scientist, so I never present data that is not backed by research. We have it on hand, and we will certainly send you all a Google Drive file with multiple articles, both social science literature as well as newspaper articles. It's going to take you all quite some time to read through it, but I will certainly pass on all that data.
We'll look forward to getting the information. Is there anyone else who wishes to be heard on this item? And members of the committee and council, I think it might be best to bring this back for consideration and discussion in February. We'll get the information from the Tri-Abolition Project and the other groups that are involved, and we'll come back and see if we can't come to a general consensus. Is that fair? I see lots of nods.
Yes.
Okay, great. Is there anyone else who wishes to be heard on this item or any other item for the good of the order? Seeing no one further, we thank you all for coming to the table, trying to work this thing out. Government isn't always pretty. I hear it's kind of like making sausage, but at the end of the day, we all love this community. We want to see it move forward, and I'm happy to be at the table to try to make it happen. So that concludes our Public Safety Committee. We thank you for coming to the table and making your voice heard, and we consider this meeting to be adjourned. Thank you.